Evening, everyone, or good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. That's one thing that's so great about these programs is that we're just reaching people from all over. Welcome to the debut lecture of Lana Slutsky, Curator of Collections and Exhibitions. Most of you probably know me. My name is Amy Consalvi. I am the Director of Education and Visitor Services at the museum. To give you a little insight into museum operations, I will tell you that the search for a curator was long and arduous. We were searching for someone who not only had a deep respect for and understanding of Russian iconography, but who could reinvigorate our interpretation of the collection and breathe new life into our temporary exhibitions. Not only were we impressed with Lana's credentials, which I will get to in just a moment, but we were excited by her enthusiasm and flexibility and willingness to adapt to the new normal that we find ourselves in. Lana Slutsky received her PhD from the History of Art and Architecture department at Boston University, where her dissertation focused on how aristocratic women preserved Byzantine culture after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. She has presented her work at national and international conferences and has been funded by a number of prestigious grants and fellowships. She previously worked at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston for over 10 years, where she conducted research and lectured on a wide variety of topics and exhibitions. She also taught at many academic institutions in the Boston area, including MassArt, Simmons University, Boston University, and the Hellenic College of the Holy Cross. Lana, let me officially welcome you to the museum team. We are delighted to have you, and with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you all so much for attending this evening. I'm really delighted to be here this evening with all of you. I have to say, as far as technical difficulties are concerned, I actually have a second monitor to my left, so that's where I'll be reading my notes from. So I apologize for not looking at you directly as I present. This is my first lecture as curator of the Museum of Russian Icons, but the topic that I have chosen to speak to you about this evening, the complex relationship between the visual cultures of Byzantium and Russia, has been on my mind for many years. The interaction between cultures, the convergence and divergence of specific artistic techniques, styles, and themes, the development of cultural norms are all crucial for understanding the history of visual culture. The idea of a cultural melting pot is something that we frequently attribute to our own time, but in reality, history has witnessed many such moments, and some of the most interesting and profound cultural traditions come about as a result of such joining. Rather than a comprehensive history, this lecture should be understood as an overview, a series of independent, though interrelated vignettes, which taken together begin to paint the complex history of the intertwined visual traditions of Byzantium and Russia. And here, as my one graphic that is potentially not related to the lecture, I thought long and hard about an analogy that I could use, and I decided that a braid would be most appropriate. So the different strands make sense on their own, but taken together, they form an independent and different whole from the two parts. So with that in mind, let's turn our attention first to Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire was founded in the year 330 by the Emperor Constantine the Great. You see him here on the screen, who among many other accomplishments transferred the capital from Rome to a then little known city called Byzantium, which he soon renamed Constantinople, or Constantinopolis Nova Roma, the city of Constantine, the New Rome. Heavily modeled on Old Rome in its layout and construction, New Rome differed from its ancestor in what it was from the very beginning, Greek-speaking and Christian. The empire, with its resplendent capital, flourished for over 1,000 years until its fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, and was renowned for many outstanding contributions to world history, culture, and theology. Constantinople was Byzantium's capital for the empire's duration, a sprawling city of civic, imperial, and of course religious foundations. Its history is marked as much by emperors and peasants as by pilgrims and merchants, artisans and soldiers, monastics and heretics, and everyone in between. At its greatest extent, under the Emperor Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565, the Byzantines ruled nearly the entire Mediterranean region. The empire was geographically immense and diverse in every way possible. Justinian was as much an outstanding statesman and military leader as he was an avid supporter of culture. Among many other important foundations, he established the famous monastery of St. Catherine on the Sinai Peninsula and the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy. And you see on the screen here 2 arrows that point to each one. His most famous foundation, however, was the great church of the Hagia Sophia, or Holy Wisdom, which marked the epicenter of Constantinople and thus of the empire. Built by 2 Greek mathematicians, engineers, and architects in just 5 years, from 532 to 537, the Hagia Sophia quickly became by far the most important church in Christendom. Its construction and vast decorative program in many ways informed all later churches built in Byzantium and beyond. In the 8th and 9th centuries, Byzantium was besieged by the longest running debate on the role of images in the history of mankind. The iconoclastic controversy lasted almost 150 years and finally came to an end in the year 843. It resulted in a new set of regulations that marked nearly every aspect of the visual arts, and especially of figural representations. And on the screen, you see an image from a famous 9th century Psalter of a man whitewashing an icon. So these are the types of activities that were very frequently undertaken in this period, and much art was destroyed as a result of iconoclasm. To mark the end of iconoclasm, the ruling patriarch commissioned the following mosaic in the apse of the Hagia Sophia. Both the representation of the Virgin and Child and its location in the apse came to serve as a model for nearly all subsequent Orthodox churches. The image was famously described by the patriarch at its installation. And I'm going to read the quote to you in a moment. Amy, are you able to move the 2 images from the screen? It's interrupting the text.
Okay.
No problem. I'll do it here. Okay. A virgin mother carrying in her pure arms for the common salvation of our kind, the common creator reclining as an infant, that great and ineffable mystery. A virgin mother with both a virgin's and a mother's gaze, dividing in indivisible form her temperament between both capacities, yet belittling neither by its incompleteness. And the underlined parts that you see on the screen are the most important for us today. With such exactitude has the art of painting, which is a reflection of inspiration from above, set up a lifelike imitation. For she fondly turns her eyes upon her begotten child in the affection of her heart. You might think her not incapable of speaking. To such an extent have the lips been made flesh by the colors, that they appear merely to be pressed together and stilled as in the mysteries. Yet their silence is not at all inert, neither is the fairness of her form derivatory, but rather it is the real archetype. These words offer both a profound theological statement on the role of the visual and a description of artists and their work in Byzantium. The ethereally beautiful image serves also as a concise statement on the multisensory, interactive, and divine nature of Byzantine images and their relationship with the viewer. Such ideas apply as much to this mosaic as to any other portable or monumental image in Orthodox culture. And it is with such an outlook that we ought to approach all the visual material described this evening. And I just want to draw your attention to the last underlined part, the second part. To such an extent have the lips been made flesh by the colors that if you read that carefully, if you think about what these words are saying, essentially the patriarch is putting the idea into the viewer's mind that you're not looking at a mosaic, but rather you're looking at the actual Virgin, that the painter has the ability, has the divinely inspired ability to make something that is material, so by definition, not alive, come alive in the most profound and divine of ways. And so this is, as I mentioned, it's a complicated statement, but it's one that is really important for understanding how Byzantine art and visual culture functioned. After iconoclasm, Byzantine culture both flourished and became more systematized. Many of the buildings were built and decorated in a relatively standard manner, and here's just one prominent example, an 11th century Greek monastery. The interior is decorated with stunningly executed mosaics. Most prominent is the colossal dome, which centers on a monumental mosaic of the Pantocrator, or ruler of all, image of Christ. Surrounded by scenes of the Annunciation, Epiphany, Nativity, and Transfiguration, the image dominates the church. Frequently touted as one of the most iconic Middle Byzantine mosaics, this Christ is massive in terms of both size and impact. Simultaneously tense and markedly serene, he projects as much power and majesty as compassion. Compositionally, the sinuous curves are balanced by the strong use of color. In all, this image, like all those found at Daphne, is an excellent comparison to the early Russian examples that we will see in just a few minutes. In this Annunciation, seen to the left of the central image of Christ, the Virgin and Archangel Gabriel actively engage the semicircular niche into which they're placed. The structure not only ideally emphasizes the function of the narrative, but also allows for an interactive relationship with the viewer below. Such interaction is activated by gestures, eye movements, and the movement of figures through space. As they walk across the gold backdrop, a truly Byzantine sense of divinity is evoked. The figures remain outside the constraints of time and space, and yet very much present in the time and space of the viewer. In such a way, this example, as well as most Byzantine art, remains always accessible, but just outside our reach. And here, I want to draw your attention to the way that the Archangel interacts with the Virgin. So you can see that he's looking at her very directly, but instead of looking back at him, as would seem to be the logical way that two figures interact in space, she is looking at us. And so this is what I mean by this constant, almost triangular relationship between us and the two divine figures. Byzantine art is always very inclusive, and this is a way in which this is very visible here. Okay. So now I'm just going to make a quick transition to Kievan Rus. And so one thing to keep in mind is that in the Middle Byzantine period, you can see that Byzantium has already been in power for roughly 700-800 years. And Kievan Rus, not this image that you see on the screen, but the subsequent ones, the Kievan Rus tradition is just beginning. So we sort of take off in modern day Ukraine and Russia, where Byzantium is already a full-fledged, very well-developed culture. But first to the early tradition. The pre-Christian Greeks and Scythian tribesmen from Asia Minor arrived in southern Russia in approximately 650 BC and established a vast trade network. Native grain, furs, and hides were exchanged for Greek metalwork, jewelry, and pottery. At the same time, cultural traditions as diverse as those of the Goths and various Asiatic tribes also informed the development of the art, which can be described as largely balanced, symmetrical, and geometrical in style and zoomorphic in motif. Many of these same characteristics also informed the later visual culture of the region. This belt plaque from the Metropolitan Museum of Art is emblematic of this type of decoration. The battle stalemate is a scene of nearly perfect abstraction. As the stallions push against the confines of the frame, their intertwined bodies create a pattern of heads and ears, hoofs and tails, and arched backs. The viewer can simultaneously focus on the struggle and get lost in the prevalent interest in pattern and design. Although such decorative arts flourished in this very early period, there is no monumental art, and thus the true beginning Beginnings of this region's rich visual tradition dates to the years 988-89, when Kievan Rus, the largest and most powerful of the independent local principalities, converted to Orthodox Christianity and subsequently adopted the dominant visual forms of Byzantium. The history of the military and trade relationship between Rus and Byzantium prior to the 10th century is way beyond the scope of tonight's talk. So I'll simply mention here that the trade routes were firmly established by this period, and that throughout the 6th to the 8th centuries, there were multiple attacks by the Slavs on Constantinople, with the most prominent one occurring in 860, relatively shortly before the conversion of Rus took place. In the 950s, the regent of Kievan Rus named Olga traveled to Constantinople to visit Emperor Constantine VII. There, she converted to Christianity, taking the name Helena, in a grand ceremony attended by both the emperor and the patriarch. This event was the turning point that marked the much more positive military, trade, religious, and cultural alliance between the two powers. Olga's grandson, Vladimir, formed an alliance with Basil II, also the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, and married Basil's sister Anna in the year 988. After his marriage, he officially adopted Orthodox Christianity as the state religion and its culture as his own. And here, I'll just very briefly put up two images on the screen of coins. The ones above are the minted coins of Vladimir, and the ones below are those of Basil II. And I think I don't need to spend a lot of time discussing the very obvious similarities between the two. These are just coins. This is really something that was seen across the board in nearly all aspects of visual culture of this period in Vladimir's time. For the sake of time, I'm gonna skip this slide for now. Vladimir's most important building foundation, that of the Church of the Assumption, was in most ways a Byzantine building. But although it was constructed of brick and stone by Byzantine architects and builders, the foundations were oak in the traditional manner of Kievan Rus. Colloquially, the church became known as the Church of the Dime because 1/10 of Vladimir's revenue was used for its construction. The original, which had been decorated with Byzantine-style floor and wall mosaics, was destroyed by the Mongols in 1240, which is why we can unfortunately only look at a model of the original building now. And so on the right-hand side of the screen, you see the image of the church, and on the left hand, a reconstruction of the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, a very famous church that was destroyed after the fall in 1453. And you can see in the aerial view the similarities between the two. Vladimir's grandson, Yaroslav, built Kiev's prime cathedral and site of coronations, St. Sophia Cathedral, named after its Constantinopolitan namesake, the Hagia Sophia. Both its architects and builders were Byzantine, but native laborers also helped with its construction. The church followed a Byzantine plan, though the prolific ornamentation of the domes and drums, as well as the great number of large windows, had never been seen in Byzantium. The decorative effects in both the interior and exterior of this and other churches have a unique sense of rhythm, betraying the simultaneous dependence on the Byzantine visual tradition and its sharp distinction from it, even in this early period. On the inside, the church presents a typically Byzantine complexity and sophistication. The mosaics are similarly audience-oriented, though there's also a great deal of ornamentation and patterning throughout. And here I'd like to draw your attention to the central dome, and even with this distant view, and I'll zoom in just a moment, you can already see that the patterning is very different than what we saw at the monastery at Daphne. And so here's the comparison imagery, and you can see that the placement of it is strictly Byzantine, but that as I already mentioned, the ornamentation and the patterning is much more in tune with that belt buckle that I showed several slides ago than with the Byzantine image. And what I mean is that can you see my cursor on the screen? Can you see it? No. Okay, it's okay. It's an evening. It's an evening of minor technical difficulties. But imagine that I'm tracing the outline of the drapery. You can see how closely the artist follows the pattern, how closely he or how complex that patterning is and how repetitive it is at the same time. There's also, if you compare the two images, a very strict symmetry in the Kievan example as compared to the Byzantine one. And those are two of the differences between the native tradition, especially in this early period, and the Byzantine one from which it stems. Okay. Icons. So I'd now like to transition to icons, which have rightly been called the dominant manifestation of Russia's pictorial expression, and which are, of course, very much informed by Byzantium, but also, as you'll see in a moment, distinctly different from the tradition that we saw there. The earliest image of the Virgin and Child, the Byzantine Hodegetria, was derived from an icon said to have been painted by St. Luke himself from life. It was kept in the Hodogon monastery and considered to be the palladium or the protector of Constantinople and thus of the entire Byzantine Empire. It was destroyed in 1453, but many replicas are preserved throughout both the East and the West. The most revered icon in medieval Russia, the Vladimir Theotokos, is based on the Hodogon exemplar. It was brought from Constantinople in the early 12th century and was initially kept near Kiev, but was soon translated to the city of Vladimir, where a splendid white church was built especially to house this image. And by the way, if you look at this church, which we're not going to talk about in any detail, unfortunately, notice that the squat Byzantine dome, which you saw in the monastery, in the Greek monastery, as well as in the image of the Hagia Sophia, has been replaced by the elongated Russian dome. In the 15th century, this beautiful icon was solemnly transferred to Moscow and kept in the Kremlin Church of the Assumption until 1918. Hundreds of copies of this icon were made throughout Russian history, and it is an image that I'm sure most of you are very familiar with. Its forms are emblematic of not only the type of art seen in Byzantium, but also of the beauty and reverence which we'll see in the Russian tradition in a moment as well. Here is where the icon is kept now. It's kept in the museum church, so it is at the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow, but there is a church that's attached to it, and so it's kept there in bulletproof frame you see on the screen. So I'd like to transition to an artist who is rightly known as the Michelangelo of the East, and someone with whom perhaps, again, many of you here tonight are familiar. This is the iconographer Andrei Rublev, who is someone who, on the one hand, was very much dependent on the Byzantine tradition of icon painting, but on the other hand, who largely severed ties with the traditional Byzantine heritage in terms of his style, and developed an independent and very unique style of painting. And so here, not coincidentally, I bring in his Vladimir Theotokos from the late 14th or early 15th century as a comparative image. And here's a detail of it. The best way to describe this work is with the word equilibrium. The value of his painting styles lies in an unequivocal harmony of color, line, and composition. The forms flow from one to the other. The figures are always simultaneously intricately connected and completely separate from each other. The embrace of the Virgin and Child has never been paralleled in the history of art as it has in this composition. The next image that I'd like to show you, and for those of you who are Rublev fans, we'll come back to his work in just a few minutes, is this one that you see on the screen. And this is by a leading iconographer of the late 17th century. So we're skipping ahead by approximately 300 years to show you another comparison of the Vladimir Theotokos. Ushakov was known for his many works depicting the so-called fleshly saints with much more human traits than was seen in the poetic and rhythmical works of Andrei Rublev. You can see that the modeling is much more strong in terms of the flesh tones. The way that the colors are placed onto on the icon are distinct. They're sharp. The lines are more angular, and that quality of poetic resonance, which is so characteristic of Rublev, is wholly absent here, which is, by the way, not to say that one is better than the other, just to underline how different they are. And so as a comparison between the three icons, you can see the Byzantine prototype with the Vladimir Theotokos, the one on the very left-hand side of the screen. The Rublev image is next, and then the Ushakov is last. And you can see how the same type of icon, it is the same in terms of theme, the same very much in terms of its composition, is rendered in very different ways depending on the artist. The most famous icon painted by Rublev was his Holy Trinity, and it was painted for the monastery of St. Sergius, which later became the most important monastery in Russia. In this icon, Rublev strips the composition of any distracting details and weaves in the three figures of the Holy Trinity into a vision of luminous and intersecting circles. This is originally derived from the image of the hospitality of Abraham, and usually in scenes of the hospitality, you have Abraham and Sarah welcoming the three unknown guests, which are the Holy Trinity, into their home. Here you can see that both Abraham and Sarah are notably absent, as are any other compositional details. Instead, Rublev creates a typically lyrical composition in which the three figures are on the one hand woven together, and on the other, as perhaps will be reminiscent of an earlier image that we saw, very much inclusive of the viewer, so that the viewer is always, as in the Byzantine tradition, invited into the image. Another example that I'd like to tell you about this evening is an image of the Oran's Theotokos, which you see on the screen here. This one is from the 13th century, and it is again typologically related to a popular type of icon in Constantinople. In this image, the Virgin stands in a frontal position, facing the spectator in an ancient gesture of prayer. This icon by an unknown artist is of the highest quality. It is delicate, well-balanced, and expressive, luminous in color, and monumental in the strength of its draftsmanship and line. The stance and facial expression are both formal and profoundly sensitive. The drapery is rhythmic, schematic, and powerful. And here's just a detail of it. You can see how exquisitely the lines are rendered, and at the same time, there's such a sensitivity of color. The transitions between the colors within the composition are absolutely perfect. Interestingly, from this image and the circumstances of its veneration, developed a specifically Russian type of icon, which was not seen in Byzantium, and that is the icon of Pokrov, or the intercession of the Theotokos, which you see here on the screen. The Virgin floats above her worshippers below, and you can see the icon screen is dominated by not only the image of her, but also of the angels and saints to the left and to the right. And you can see a domed cupolas of churches in the background. Incidentally, the most famous church in all of Russia was named for the intercession of the Theotokos, or the Pokrov, and this is of course St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. Icons were so dominant and so popular in the Russian tradition that another very unique development occurred in the 14th and 15th centuries, and that is the development of the iconostasis, or the icon screen. Now, such icon screens did, of course, exist in Byzantium, but they were much lower. They were not nearly as decorative, and they were never as tall. And this example here, you can see that there are 6 different tiers. Some of the later, more ornate iconostasis could have up to 15 tiers. So they would take up the entire height of the church, which was extraordinary, and not only visually extraordinary, but also served to really emphasize the independence of the Russian tradition in terms of its Orthodox art. Well, you might wonder what is happening in Byzantium at this time, because we've completely transitioned to Russia. Sadly, in Byzantium, we have the fall of Constantinople in 1453. But if you're wondering, but did the tradition end there? Of course it didn't. And post-Byzantine art was very prominent and continued both throughout the Mediterranean and well beyond. The Russian tradition had already been well established by this time, and to demonstrate the importance of Byzantium in Russia, even in the 15th century, and I would say especially after the fall of Constantinople, I'd like to introduce you to a woman with whom I am very familiar from my dissertation work, and that is Sophia Palaiologos, who was the daughter she was the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. And this is a forensic reconstruction of her from 1994. She was a very interesting figure in that she escaped from Constantinople, ended up in Italy, grew up in the papal court, and eventually married Tsar Ivan III of Moscow. So she became the Tsarina. Now, what's interesting about her is that when she moved to Moscow, she brought with her a huge wealth of objects. And so she was important in that she was a Byzantine princess that came to the city, but also in that she brought a lot of different icons. And one of the many icons that she brought is this one that you see on the screen. It's an icon of Saint John the Baptist. It is Byzantine. It's from the 14th or first half of the 15th century, and it's now located in the Moscow Kremlin Museum. The image of John the Baptist is one that had not previously been seen in the Russian tradition. And on the back side of the icon is an emblem. So first at the top, you see a cross. The bottom one, which I cannot trace with my cursor on the screen, but the bottom one that looks like a shield says Thomas Palaiologos, which is the name of her father. And so we know that this was a familial icon that she carried with her, likely from Constantinople to Rome, and from there to Moscow. Icons that were directly modeled on this image of St. John the Baptist became very prolific in Russia throughout the later part of the 16th century. And there are many such examples, with this one likely being the most prominent one. So we see that from the very beginning of Byzantium's relationship with Russia, there was a strong correlation not only between the types and the styles of icons that were created, but also the techniques and the methodologies that characterize them. There is much more to say, but for the sake of time, I will end here and say thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming this evening, and I very much hope to see you at the museum. We are open as of right now. Hopefully that won't change. We're open Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, and it would be all of our pleasures to welcome you there. And thank you.
Thank you, Lana, for the really, really fascinating lecture. I was over here taking a few notes and thinking about, how can we incorporate some of this information into, our interpretation in the galleries, and also maybe into some of our school programs. So thank you. I think at this point, we'll open it up to questions and answers. So please use the Q&A feature down below on the bottom of your screen in Zoom. And we'll just wait for some questions to come in. Thank you. And yes, and just in case anyone missed the question earlier, this is being recorded and it will go up on our website in probably about 1 to 2 weeks. And you can find most of our programs, past programs recorded on our website as well. The only thing that we typically don't record are our workshops for obvious reasons. So right off the bat, great question. Byzantine depictions of the Virgin show her clothed in a blue cloak, Russian in red. Why the difference?
Oh, that's a great question. A lot of Russian icons do show her in blue. Blue is the traditional color. To be honest with you, I have never actually found out the true answer to that. I know that there are overlaps between the two, and it's actually there are in the Byzantine tradition you don't see red, but in the Russian tradition you do frequently see blue. So it's a very good question. I don't have a very good answer for that. I apologize, but I can, if Amy, if you write down who asked the question, I'll gladly do a bit more research into it and email the person. I have to say that the use of colors, both in Byzantium and of specific colors, both in Byzantium and in Russia, is a very symbolic exercise. And so there's always a reason attached to why certain colors are used, as well as the combination of different colors. So, thank you.
Absolutely. And that question was by Kent Russell, so we know where to find him.
Thank you.
You just have to walk across the museum. If you could talk a little bit about the medium used in painting icons in Byzantium. One person is asking, was it egg tempera? And maybe could you talk about a little bit about the development of metal icons?
Okay, yes. So in Byzantium, it was absolutely egg tempera, as was the case in Russia as well. Although there were different materials that were used depending on, for example, the wealth of the person who commissioned the icon. So I don't have a good image for you this evening, but there are, for example, ivory icons, right, which were created out of pure ivory. Those were usually made for the wealthiest of patrons. For metal icons, there's a strong tradition both in Byzantium and in Russia of what are known as revetments or icon frames. And revetments are actually, if you go on our website, on the museum website, we have a lot of beautiful examples, both ones that are metal and also ones that are done with precious stones, and they can get incredibly ornate. And for the sake of time, because I knew that we were running a little bit late, I actually have an image of the clad, or the revetment of the Vladimir Theotokos, the original one that I showed. And if you want to look that up, it's a really stunning example. And I believe that the metal icons developed from the tradition of using those beautiful revetments, which are, as I said, artworks on their own. They're really beautiful and ornate. Also, as far as materials are concerned, initially, both in Byzantium, and this is something that stemmed from the Roman tradition, there were a lot of, not just initially, I should take that back, throughout the history of Byzantium, a lot of frescoes that were made. So fresco icons were not usually portable, but there are some examples of those as well. And also, in addition to egg tempera, both in Byzantium and in Russia, there is, of course, a tradition of using gold and silver and other precious materials on the surface of the icon. I don't know if that answers your question fully, but do take a look at our site and the revetments that we have at our museum.
Yes.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, that was a great question. And yes, great point that our collection is fully searchable on our website. So that's a really, really great jumping off point for anyone looking to do research in this area. I'm going to kind of combine these two questions, mostly because we get this question actually quite a bit in the museum with our visitors. Theologically, are there differences between Byzantine and Russian? No.
No. I mean, well, I should qualify that. No, but if you consider, for example, the development of a feast day, so the icon of the intercession of Pakrov, which I showed in the middle of the presentation, that's something that's Russian. So then if there's a new feast day, is that a theological difference? I don't know. It depends on how you look at it. But from the outset, you can think of it as a common tree, as a common root. And as far as I know, there were no theological differences. Now, of course, if you're thinking about the, let's say, the Orthodox visual tradition in the West today, there are many differences, right? There are many jurisdictions and there are theological differences between them. But in the beginning, in the early period that we're talking about, as I said, as far as I'm concerned, no, they're not.
Great. And to kind of piggyback off of that, offhand, do you know any saints in particular that were really favored either in Russia or Byzantium? Did those saints overlap between the two?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So one that comes to mind is Saint Nicholas, and it's very appropriate with Christmas coming up. And Saint Nicholas is a saint that was very much revered both in Byzantium and in Russia. And in fact, to take it back to our museum, we have a whole wall of Saint Nicholas icons. So it's a subject that appears very, very frequently in Russian iconography and again in Byzantine as well. Other saints that come to mind, John the Baptist, Saint Demetrius. Essentially, to answer that question, if you look at the common Russian names and you think about which saints are associated with those names, then you'll quickly figure out who the saints are. And the same in Byzantium, right? If you look through the registers of various archives of people that lived in the Byzantine Empire, you'll see a lot of Helenas, a lot of Constantines, and of course you see that in Russia as well. So that's a very easy way to figure out the answer. But Saint Nicholas came to mind first, so I'll stick with that.
He is one of the favorites for sure. This question addresses patronage, and this person was curious how artists such as Rublev generally received patronage for their iconography in Russia. Were they associated with a particular church or court? And did modes of icon patronage change over time from early to late Russia?
Well, that's a great question. That must be coming from an art historian. So patronage is complicated because both, and I'll take it back to Byzantium just for a moment, but both in Byzantium, I should say initially in Byzantium and then in Russia, the dominant patronage base is the imperial family, the aristocratic classes. And that's for a very obvious reason, right? Those who have money are able to commission specific works. They're able to employ talented artists. Those who don't have as much money, they buy whatever is available, usually not by someone who is as well known. And I believe that that's the case that was the case in certainly in Kiev and Rus, and then in later periods in Russia as well. Rublev is an interesting example because he was a monastic. He was not, and actually, just to back up for a second, traditional iconographers, though this is not the case for 100% of the cases, but for many cases, they were monastics, right? So they lived in monasteries. They were not necessarily attached to a specific court because that would not have necessarily been appropriate. And if a particular emperor or a particular czar enjoyed the art of the icons of a specific iconographer, he or she could of course buy those. But as far as I know, Rublev specifically was not necessarily attached to a court, even though there are many examples of his work in Moscow, a lot of monumental paintings and also portable images as well. Does that answer the question? Maybe Amy, you can ask in the chat if that's.
Yeah, feel free to.
Yeah, if there's a follow-up question, please ask. But that's my That's my sense in terms of patronage, both in Russia and of course that changes, right? That's in both in Byzantium and in Russia as time goes on. You can have patronage bases that are of the middle and sometimes even the lower classes, though not for an artist like Rubyov. That would not have been the case. So.
Right. Right. So speaking of Byzantine icon painters, would they have ever traveled to medieval France and Spain in the 9th and 10th centuries to work there?
Yes, they would have. So Romanesque, the Romanesque European tradition, if the person that asked the question is familiar with that. So the Romanesque period, which I guess that's more the period I was asked about is 9th, 10th centuries, right? So that's a little bit before. So late medieval, maybe very, very beginnings of the Romanesque, was marked by pilgrimage. And these pilgrimages circumvented the entire European continent. And the Byzantines were not shy about their art, about, let's say, to use a contemporary term, about marketing it, about selling it in other parts of the world. So, for example, this is a slightly later image that's coming to mind, but if any of you have been to the Museum of Fine Arts, we have at the MFA, there's a beautiful Catalonian fresco of Christ in Majesty. It's in a standalone sort of a gallery that's meant to replicate a Romanesque chapel. And I've always loved that image. It's one that I spent many hours talking in front of and visiting. The reason I loved it is because it's really Byzantine. And the question is, well, how in Spain, how did they find out about the Byzantine style? So we think that there were artists and artisans that traveled back and forth and that would share, much like they did in Russia, would share their techniques and styles and themes that were represented with their Western counterparts. There's certainly no reason to think that they didn't do that. The most prominent example of that in Europe is Italy, but it was done everywhere. So, yeah.
Great.
And just as a follow-up point to that, an anecdotal story, I once thought I could get away from Byzantium, and I was on a trip to Iceland, and I remember that I walked into a museum in Reykjavik, and the first thing I saw was a 12th century Byzantine piece. And so to that question, do you find Byzantium or Byzantine art in France and in Spain? Yes, the reality is you find Byzantine art absolutely everywhere. Potentially not in the Caribbean, but that's about the only place you can go to escape it. So,
it's funny where we see these motifs and these images just really everywhere. Once you really start looking for them and become familiar with them, it's a language all unto itself. And once you learn to read it, you're seeing it everywhere.
yes.
So speaking about sort of different stylistic differences within the icons, could you comment at all about the regional differences in Russia and how to distinguish icons from different regions? For example, what a Novgorodian icon would look like.
Yeah, that's a big topic, and Amy can attest to the fact that we talk about this at the museum, and it's one of the projects that I've been thinking about a lot, is how to describe these differences in simple, recognizable ways. Because of course, my talk tonight, I have to admit, it was short in terms of time period allotted, but the topic is immensely, almost overwhelmingly huge. And so what do you include? How do you distinguish, Russian icons? That's an enormous topic. And so without giving specific characterizations of, say, like you said, Amy, Novgorod or Moscow or Kiev, what I can say is that as your eyes become more trained, more attuned with different styles, you'll begin to notice that certain colors are used more prominently. The way that the lines are put on the composition are used in softer and more subtle ways, or as in the example of Ushakov, which I showed earlier, harsher and perhaps more, the word that's coming to mind is Hellenistic, but just slightly harsher ways. In terms of themes, there's of course complete overlap. because the country is Orthodox, and so there's not going to be a difference in terms of theme. But in terms of style, there are more subtle differences. And also, I should say that there are differences not only geographically, but also chronologically. So that's something else to think about, is if you're looking at the earlier period, you'll see a certain style in a particular place. And then as you move through time, out of necessity, of course, that style changes. So come to the museum in a few months, and hopefully we'll have some new text panels explaining this in very accessible ways.
Yes. Or we'll just have to do a whole lecture series.
We'll do that. Yeah. We'll do a virtual rather than in person.
Yes. So kind of switching gears a little bit to architecture, can you speak a little on the evolution of domes in Russian architecture? Is there any evidence of the dome style being used prior to the Slavic interaction with Byzantium, or is this dome style largely a product of its Byzantine predecessor?
Yes, it is a product of the Byzantine predecessor because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, there is no monumental construction prior to the conversion to Christianity. The difference mainly, and this is a bit of a generalization, but again, mainly they are elongated and there are more of them. And this is one thing that I perhaps should have said when I discussed the images at St. Sophia Cathedral is that you'll notice that on the inside, and this is related to domes, even though I'm not speaking about domes right now, but you notice that level of ornamentation and symmetry is so deep and profound that it's as if the artists almost get lost in it. And that was why I showed that belt buckle in the beginning, is that this is the type of art that's native to the region. Now, if you translate that to architecture, it's essentially the same thing. The elongation of the domes, and then eventually the development, of course, of the very traditional onion domes, that's something that in terms of architecture, in terms of structure, it's not necessary. But in terms of patterning and design, it creates a visual message that is much more in line with the native tradition. And that's quite obviously something that the architects and the artists were, well, for lack of a better word, infatuated with. And so that's why it becomes so dominant. And once it takes off, it becomes almost, like I said, an infatuation or almost like an obsession, because these domes are just an art form of in and of themselves, almost independent of the architecture.
Yes, they are just absolutely stunning and just quite interesting to look at. So we have just about 1 minute left. So I'm going to ask you a question. I know you've gotten to see a lot of these ancient icons in person. Which one really stood out as just absolutely magnificent, just took your breath away, and why?
And why, huh? So can I use a monumental example rather than a portable one, or are you specifically, because I was thinking for the portable one, it would have to probably be the Vladimir icon, which when I saw it in Moscow, it takes your breath away. But it takes your breath away as an art historian on many different levels, right? Because on the one hand, you're looking at it as an image that is just so ubiquitous. And I hate making this comparison, but I'm going to have to. It's like seeing the Mona Lisa, right? It's so famous. It's so prevalent that to see it in person is a complicated experience. And also from an artistic standpoint, it is an absolutely stunning, breathtaking icon. So that would have to be my answer for the portable one, though I have to admit that much like with the Mona Lisa, I was very disappointed that it was behind bulletproof glass. That just takes away from the experience. But I guess the most incredible icon I've ever seen has to be the image of the Virgin and Child in the apse of the Hagia Sophia. And similar experience to the Vladimir Theotokos, but different, because for whatever reason, maybe it was that day, maybe because of my experience in Istanbul on that particular trip, but it was an emotionally very, very touching experience to be in the presence of that mosaic. And I know that I glossed over that text a little bit in the presentation. So I hope all of you listening will have a chance to go back to it and really read it and really think about it. If you have that text in mind, when you look at that image, it comes alive. And I have no other way to describe it other than the fact that you really feel like you're standing in front of the Theotokos and child. And it was a transformative experience. And I hope that many of you have had that experience, and those of you that haven't, well, I won't comment on the possibility or impossibility of doing that now, but hopefully someday, if you haven't, you'll be able to do that in person, not virtually. So that's my response. And I do see on the screen, Amy, I don't know if you see this as well, there are other questions. So I'd just like to say that at the beginning of the presentation, I had my email on the first slide. If you didn't see it, I'm very easy to find. If you go to the Museum of Russian Icons website, my email is there, but it's just lana@museumofrussianicons.org. Please feel free to send me your questions, comments, suggestions, research ideas. I am always very happy to hear from you, and especially in this time when everything is virtual, it's nice to feel connected to the audience. So please do send me your questions and comments.
Yes, I typically will follow up with an email with a program survey, so I'll be sure to include your contact information as well. And normally, if this was in person, we would be exiting the auditorium and having a glass of wine or something like that to celebrate. But unfortunately, we'll all just have to make do with what we have at home. So thank you, Lana. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And we will see you at the next program. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.